Hello, guys. This is Aaron Enley with Clint Endress here. For the next little bit, we're going to be going over some basic entry-level 2020 screen pushes and metrics, what you see on the home screen, and just work down through some of those items. So we've got a simulator running here on a Gen 3. Most or all of this will also apply to a Gen 2, but what you see on the screen is a Gen 3, and it's a 24-row planner, I believe. So just to start with, let's just talk about the home screen itself. So let the color draw your eye. So green is good, yellow is caution, and red is stop or watch out or do something. That's an action item if it's red. Just like a stoplight, green is good, yellow is caution, and red is stop. So on this screen right now, we see the singulation is running very good. On these major metrics, you can always touch and go deeper into just about any metric. So we're going to click on singulation here, and there's 3 levels of depth to the population and singulation, for example. So we're going to touch on singulation, and here you see all 24 rows under the singulation metric. Now looks like they're turning around, so everything went to 0. But so you see all 24 rows. If you see you're looking for patterns or outliers or something that's out of the ordinary, that's kind of what you're always looking for when you're planting, is something that looks out of place. So so you see all 24 rows, and then you can see if we can get this to refresh here. There we go. So I'm going to click on singulation and just that's level 2, and then we're going to click on row 8 here and go into the most detailed level. So this is all the information about row 8: population, singulation. This row happens to have a waypin on it, so you're getting a downforce and margin metric. And these are the live seeds coming out the back of the row or the meter. So a green seed is acceptable, and they're not spaced perfectly, as you can see, but they're acceptable enough to make them green. So let's hit the back arrow twice to get back to the home page, and we could do the same thing on population. We can click population, and we can click row 9 this time and see that all of the same metrics for row 9. It also has a waypin on it because we're getting downforce and margin. It does not have a smart firmer on it because we don't get organic matter.
So one of the things that you can identify problems with, particularly those of you that might be running ground drives or even having hydraulic drives, this level 2 segment here is pretty critical in helping me identify if I've got a row problem, or I might see multiple rows in a drive section that are being impacted. So it's meant to help you understand if I've got a section problem or a row problem, which is why this particular second level screen is handy. So once we're lifted here and not planting, but once I go into that, I can see that and get more visibility and start to identify if there's a problem somewhere. Another segment here that we want to highlight, those of you that have the Gen 1s and Gen 2s will have a major metric called good spacing. Now, on the Gen 3, we don't have that metric, but a couple of metrics that we can use to identify whether or not we have a spacing problem are in this good ride metric and this SRI metric. Now, each, whether you've got a row unit module or a single row module on your planter, both of them will have an accelerometer in that box that's measuring the movement up and down on that row unit. And we're going to report that movement in this good ride metric. So if your good ride metric is, I think 90 or above, we're going to flag you as green. And for all intents and purposes, if your singulation is doing well and your downforce is doing well and your good ride is okay, there would be reason for you, if you so chose to, maybe just bump up your speed a little bit in order to continue and press on and maybe get a few more acres throughout. This SRI metric that right now is not displaying anything for us is meant to give us a visibility as we look at the planted or the picket stand that we're striving for, but this percentage, the lower the better. So on a test stand, where my row unit and my meter are stable, my SRI is probably going to be under 10 or close to it.
12. 12 is common. We'll see 12 on test stands. Actually, finger meters have a better SRI than vac meters generally. But
and SRI, I apologize, stands for seed release. So we're looking at, oh, there it comes, how that seed comes off of the meter. And so when is it a crisp, clean cut when I cut vac and as my disc spins on there? One of the things that can play a part in that is not having enough graphite talc E-flow blend in my boxes that can help me decrease that SRI. But theoretically in the field, we're definitely going to see a higher SRI because of the movement in the row unit and the meter. And so we're probably going to see
20 is acceptable. 15 to 18 it'd be,
ideal, probably
better, but 20 is acceptable. And if you had an SRI is kind of a fancy name for spacing. So if you had an SRI of 0, that would mean every single seed was like perfectly spaced, one seed to the next. There was no variation whatsoever, would be a SRI of 0, which is not really possible, but that's what the goal would be, I guess. So SRI is if you have a seed that's 1/4 of an inch closer to its neighbor than the last one, or 1/2 of an inch closer to its neighbor, that actually gets calculated and docks your SRI. So it's talking about very, very small measurements, which is why it's impossible to get 0 on SRI. So for the Gen 1 and Gen 2 users that have a good spacing metric, the standard is 2.5 or 2.8 inches and 4.5 inches. So any seed that is within 4.5 inches of its neighbor gets flagged as a mildly misplaced seed, and then if it gets within 2.8 inches of its neighbor, so a lot closer to its neighbor, it gets flagged as a severely misplaced seed, and that goes against your spacing metric. So SRI is more strict of a spacing metric, you might say, because it's going to dock you for 1/4 of an inch of perfect, whereas spacing's not going to dock you until you get within 4.5 inches from its neighbor, and maybe you're planting 6 inches apart at 35,000 roughly. So SRI is more strict than what you'll see as spacing on a Gen 1 and Gen 2. So to further define spacing compared to singulation, spacing is or let's think of singulation as meter performance and spacing as the delivery from the meter to the ground. So you most certainly can have perfect singulation and horrible spacing. Because if there's a corn cob that got wedged up the bottom of your seed tube when you set the planter down to fill it, your meter might be nailing every single seed, but your spacing is horrible because it's ricocheting off that corn cob, and vice versa. You can have a plugged cell or two in a disc, so the meter is not singulating well, but the seed are falling to the ground very consistently, and so they're not really they're not synonyms for one another, really. They're not they're two separate metrics. They're not the same thing. You can't really use the term interchangeably. Singulation is not spacing, and spacing is not singulate, or yeah, spacing is not singulation. So if you have a singulation issue, its host is from the meter. If you have a spacing issue, it's the delivery to the ground is the takeaway from that. Okay. Let's continue on the home screen here to the downforce box. So all 2020s have at least 3 waypins. A lot of times you have more, but you'll have at least 3. And that's going to be represented in this downforce box here. So the metrics that you see are a average of however many waypins you have. It gives you the high and the low row here, how many pounds those waypins are seeing, and its weight on the gauge wheels is what you're measuring. Too much weight on the gauge wheels leads to sidewall compaction and restricted root growth. Not enough weight on the gauge wheels or negative weight on the gauge wheels leads to the row unit coming out of the ground and shallow planted corn, which is very detrimental to final yield, inconsistent planting depth. So the goal here for downforce is to maintain 100% ground contact, but limit margin. So as this margin number would decrease and get closer to 0, your ground contact would come off of 100. As your margin increases, your ground contact will be pegged at 100. Margin is, in simple terms, margin is the extra weight that is on your row unit that you could theoretically get rid of without losing depth. Ground contact, if you have 95% ground contact, that means that 5% of the time there is no weight on the gauge wheel. There's no weight on the waypin, which means there's no weight on the gauge wheel. And 95% of the time there is some measurable weight. So you really want this ground contact number at or near 100, 98, 99, 100, somewhere in there. Because if 5% of the time or 8% of the time your ground contact doesn't have any weight, you don't have any weight on that waypin, your row unit is almost guaranteed to be shallow planting corn or shallow planting seeds. and that's what we want to avoid. So we want to maintain 100% ground contact, but minimize the margin, which is the extra weight that your road unit's carrying. You need some margin. So I like to see 60 to 70 pounds is ideal. You need a little extra weight there to make sure that if you hit a wheel track from last year or something like that, that you've got a little bit of extra to still hit your depth, your target seating depth. But if you're up over 120 pounds of margin, 150 pounds of margin, that's most likely causing you yield loss. So again, on the downforce screen, we can touch it to get into a deeper level. So we'll click on downforce, and here we have all 24 rows displayed and the weights on the weigh pins. So you can, if you've got 1 or 2 rows that are really, really high or really, really low, maybe causing your average on the home screen to be, it may be skewing your average. So you can click on downforce and see all 24 rows, and then click on a single row, in this case, row 17. And then you can always hit the home button. There's always a home button. If you ever get lost, you can always hit the home button, takes you to the home screen. So if you're running 94% ground contact and your margins in the 20 to 30 range, you need to increase your downforce. So increase your spring pressure, increase your airbag pressure. You're running automation, downforce, you need to increase your target until we get that ground contact up around 100%, 99%, and your margin in the, anywhere between 50 to 100 is acceptable, but kind of that 70 range, 70 number is ideal for me. And you have to always take these planner settings with you have to consider the conditions always. So if you're really, really wet, like we were last spring, you're gonna cheat on the light side of downforce. If it's very cloddy and dry soil surface, you really need to maybe increase your downforce to kind of adjust for conditions. So just be aware of that. On Gen 1s and 2s, there is a loss per acre metric that is not available on Gen 3s. That is just a simple calculation of the price of corn, which can be changed in the Gen 1 and 2 compared to if you have singulation, loss of singulation, it gives a dollar value to that, and spacing issues, it gives a dollar value to that and displays that as loss per acre. So you can get a visual of what that planner errors are costing you, whether it's worth it to try to stop and fix it or not. Hex shaft error. This particular simulation is a V-drive setup, so we don't have a hex shaft. But if you're running hydraulic drives or ground drive or running a hex shaft error is a metric that can be put on the screen, home screen, and there's no sensor for a hex shaft. It is simply comparing the target population against the actual population. So what you've told the monitor, the 2020, it should be planting versus what it's actually planting. So Soft ground conditions can cause, hex shaft error to be increased. Low inflated tires can cause that. It's really designed to try to catch driveline issues. So hex shafts that are misaligned and the dog ears that drive the hex shaft on your flex points, if they're misaligned, they rub back and forth as that hex shaft makes a complete revolution. And if it's bad enough, the 2020 can pick that up. I've seen where cotter pins are broke or partially broke in the hex shaft dog ears, and it created excess slop in the dog ears, and that was picked up by the hex shaft air, and the grower was able to find that and replace that and improve his driveline health. So be aware of that. If you're running hex shafts on your planner, you may want to have the hex shaft metric on your home screen if you have room. Sometimes it gets filled up with other things, but hex shaft error is out there if you're interested. Okay, we're going to now dive into a little bit more of the planner setup. So I'm going to click on setup here. Gen 1s and 2s have the same setup button. Here we see our field name would be similar to Gen 1 and 2 and kind of our planner setup. So click on planner setup, and this is, unless you physically change something or install something or remove something from the planner, this screen's not going to change. So this is John Deere planner, 24 rows, 30 inches, all rows are active. What kind of meter and drive downforce system you have. So this is where you set up the complete planner. So if you're running a split row planner, your rows are going to be active, all rows are going to be active, and you're going to put the total number of rows in here. So if you're running a 1790 32 row 15 inch, for example, that's how you would set it up. And then I'll show you in a little bit how you change back and forth between corn and beans in the crops tab is the proper way to do that. Let's get this back to 24 inch 30. So that's your planner setup. Field name is here. We're running in the demo field. Field names are sacred. So do not create a field called replant, or do not create a field name called, if it's a 50-50 rotated field, like the back 40 corn, and then the next year you create another field name called the back 40 beans, and the next year back to corn again. Don't do that. Field names are sacred. You just give them a single name, and unless you quit farming the field or you pick up another field and create a new one, you're not going to change a field name. That gets really, really messy if you start creating field names year over year, and you got to merge them together, and it's a big mess. So here we can click on the field name. We're in the demo field. If we have a boundary file loaded in, we can assign that here. If we have a prescription, whether it's seeding or liquid in this case, we can assign that here. In this demo, we don't, but that's where that's done under the field level. Click done. I will comment on Gen 1s and 2s. There's a population setting page, assuming you're not running VDrive. And there's a multiple setting and a single setting. I would always run the single setting. There'd be a very limited number of cases where you would want to run multiple settings. Maybe if you're planting seed corn, or if you're running your drives with a third-party monitor or something like that, very specific. So for all purposes, use a single setting on your Gen 1s and 2s when setting the population for a hex shaft system. So here we also have corn hybrid. We can change corn hybrids. Right now we're planting all orange. We can change that to plant half and half with this other hybrid. We're going to go ahead and enable that. It wants to know what rows. We're going to stick this on the right. So now we're running a split planter scenario. And just a little tip, I like to create a hybrid called end rows. So we're going to add custom hybrid down here and call it end rows. And what's supposed to happen when we're planting is, where'd it go? Right here, end rows. We're going to enable that one on all. So what's supposed to happen is that we plant the end rows with the hybrid end rows, and then we plant the infield with the actual hybrids that we're planting. The risk is that you forget to plant end rows under the end rows hybrid, or you forget to change it after you're done, and then you plant half the field and it's labeled end rows. But if you do it correctly, when you harvest with YieldSense in the fall, it separates out your hybrid on your hybrid report. End rows are its own segment, and then the hybrid side-by-sides or whatever you have in the field mapped is the data you actually care about. You don't get that data skewed by the end rows. So just a little tip there for if you want to try that. Okay, we're gonna hit the home button, hit setup again, go under the crops tab. This tab is available on all 3 generations of monitors. Right now, corn is active and we're running VSETs, so we got a 27 full seed disc. All rows are active. If we were on a 1790 or a Kinsey split row, for corn, you know, this would not be the case. If we were on a 1790, the odd rows would be active, and that's the way it would be set up for corn. Then we could change our active crop to soybeans, and in a split row, all crop rows are going to be active, obviously, and so you can adjust your coverage pattern for either crop differently if you choose. And this default population section is only if you are planning a prescription and you drive outside of the prescription, what population should it plant? That's what that box is for. And we got an 80 cell disc here for the VSET. So that is all tied to soybeans. So whenever you swap back and forth between corn and soybeans, the active rows follow whatever crop is active. And these others are factory defaults. Seeds to average is 300. So the numbers you see on the home screen are a average of the last 300 seeds. So just a little, I guess, word of caution, when you change from corn to beans or beans to corn, and you start planting the first 20 to 50, 100 feet, your numbers might look very, very over-exaggerated or under-exaggerated because you still have the previous crop data in the queue that these numbers are being averaged from, and it just needs to work itself out of the system. So if you started planting corn, previously planting beans, don't be alarmed that the first 500 feet, or probably not 500, probably 50 feet or 100 feet, say that you're planting 130,000. You're really not. But that data that's kind of in the queue has to work itself through the home screen and then to your expected planting population. So that works both ways, going from corn to beans and beans to corn. Don't worry about that. It's just, it's all based from this seeds to average number. Corn, it's 300 is the default. Soybeans is 1,500. Okay. Next up, we're going to talk about tractor and GPS measurements, and then the data tab, and then we'll be done with this session. So under equipment here is our planter measurements and tractor measurements. So this is where you would enter in your measurements and the style of planter that you're pulling and your distances from the pivot point. If you're on a 3-point mount, your pivot point is going to be the rear axle of the tractor. So when you turn, where is it pivoting from? That's the rear axle on a mounted planter. Tractor measurements, same story, of where your receiver is. One kind of little tidbit there is on nav setups, Trimble navs. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times they export the globe location out of the rear axle. So this C measurement here is the distance from the globe to the rear axle would be 0 in a lot of nav setups. So once you enter this in, everybody every year needs to do a GPS offset check to make sure there's no surprises. So this involves being outside in a space large enough that you can jockey the planter around and face the other direction. You don't have to make one continuous loop. You can back up and go forward 10 times if you need to. So I'm just going to walk through this real quick to show you. You set a flag at the seed exit on either side of the planter. You have to have GPS reception, good GPS reception. Set the flags at the seed exit, which is basically the center of the gauge wheels. Tap the button. Tells you to make a loop. Turn around, whatever you need to do to be facing the other direction. About when the tractor is approaching or going through the flags, it's not too critical, but just hit the continue button again. And then stop when you are facing the other direction. And there we're back again. Stop when you're facing the other direction. Planter stopped in between the flags. Hit the button again, and what it does is it compares the measurements that you've entered in and compares that to what GPS says the measurement is. And since we are in a simulator and didn't move, it's this difference number here. I like to see 4 inches or less. If it's less than 4 inches, I'm happy. And then, so we have a very large discrepancy here, obviously, but if there does need to be a change made, I generally change the C measurement here, is what I've always done in the past, seems to work well as far as modeling and drafting, you know, the plan or whatever in the software. I changed the C measurement and have had good results with that. And then either add or subtract inches to the C measurement, and then do the check again and keep doing it until you get this number within 4 inches or less. This number up here is how how off center you are. I usually don't get very worried about this at all, because if you didn't drive through those flags perfectly straight, you know, that's going to affect this number. So don't get too worried about that. It's just this number down here. The same data is available on the Gen 1s and 2s. Everybody needs to do a GPS offset check every year to make sure there's no surprises. Then, if you complete this, your map, you can trust your map. So if there's a 6-foot gap on your map, there is probably a 6-foot gap in the field. And if it overlaps, there's an overlap in the field. So your map and your GPS will then be synced up to each other, so to speak. Also, this frame layout piece, this is what the 2020, this is how the 2020 sees your planner. So it's a good double check to make sure that there's no, you didn't accidentally enter a negative measurement somewhere up here. This is how the 2020 sees your planner. So good idea, good practice to check this before you start to make sure there's no surprise on the layout. You can also save a planner config and a tractor config. This is super handy if you're swapping tractors back and forth between planners, etc. And it's just an all-around good idea to save your, once you've done the planner measurements and GPS offset check, and that jives, save that so that if you ever have to go back to it, it's there for you to just click on and load right in. Okay. Last but not least here for this session is the data tab. So this is where this is available on all 3 generations monitors, this data piece. This is where you would import or prescription boundaries, export your data, software updates. There's also this relatively new in the last few years, this backup restore piece. So if you back up all, which everyone should really do as best practice every season before you start, it dumps everything that's on the monitor, prescriptions, data, configuration files, yield map, does everything. Everything that's on there gets dumped onto the USB stick, and it's just a backup plan, I guess. And then you can restore all as well if you need to get that back. You can export, you know, specific prescription boundaries and config files, etc. if you want, but that backup is just kind of a one-stop shop to do everything. Software update would be if you have a USB stick, you stick that in the side of the Gen 3 display and come in here and click install from USB. We don't have one, so it's giving me an error there. But on Gen 2s, I highly recommend using the middle USB port in the back, which is normally where FieldView cable is plugged into. A lot of times the other USB ports don't accept the USB or it doesn't recognize it or whatever, but that middle port in the back is always a pretty for sure bet. Gen 1s, you can use either side port on the monitor, that doesn't matter. And some USB sticks, I don't know why, some read better than others, and sometimes you put it in the port and it doesn't read and you try it again and it reads, and if it doesn't read, you go try another USB stick. I don't know what the answer is. You just fiddle with it till you get it to go, I guess. But that's where you update software. And for Gen 1 users, you're most likely on 2017.4. That is the latest and the only version that's available. There is no updates for a Gen 1 anymore. Gen 2s and Gen 3s should be on 2020.0. 2020.0, unless you're running Furrow Force, you will be on 2020.1, but do not update to 2020.1 on a Gen 3 or you will hate yourself, because it, unless you ask me first, because it reconfigures all of your settings. And so there's a very specific process we have to go through to do that. So bold letters, do not update to 2020.1 unless I tell you to, and that will be for the Furrow Force guys for this spring. You will likely need to delete your coverage files from last year. Coverage just means the paint that was generated last year. You're not deleting data, you're just deleting the paint from last year, so that when you pull into the field this year, your clutches work and they don't think that you're in previously planted area. It's not showing here on Gen 1s and Gen 2s. Sorry for that. Gen 1s and Gen 2s, under the delete button will be a delete coverage data option.
On the Gen 3s, the coverage data is going to be forgotten. It'll be time stamped, so you cannot.
So it automatically deletes.
It,
okay.
Override.
Looking here to see if I resume. Okay, I think that's it for this entry basic 2020 session. We will regroup here and get set up for the next session. Thank you for watching.